Well, hello and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Christine Nelson and I'm the Drue Heinz Curator of Literary and Historical Manuscripts at the Morgan Library and Museum. Joining you today, of course, not from the Morgan, but from my home in Philadelphia. So welcome. So when I learned that we, like many cultural institutions, were going to begin gathering with you in this new virtual way, I knew immediately which collection item I wanted to share with you. The draft manuscript and drawings for Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's story, The Little Prince. Because this is the kind of story that many of us tend to return to in times like these. So I'm really grateful to have the chance to take a close look at the story together with you, even as we are necessarily sitting apart. And of course, this is how we often experience beloved stories, sometimes together in company with other people, and sometimes in solitude. The Little Prince, for example, maybe this title page and frontispiece look very familiar to you. You may have first experienced this book in physical company with someone else. Maybe you were on the lap of a parent who was reading it to you aloud. Maybe you were together with fellow students in a high school French class trying to puzzle through a new language together. Or maybe you received a copy of the book as a gift from a friend or a lover. This happens so often. Here's an example of a copy, the dedication page. Someone has inscribed it, "In gratitude for much perseverance. You will find this story a pure delight with a simple and great message." And then it's signed at the bottom, "With dearest love from the wife." Now, I don't know these people. This is a long ago inscription, but this book passed through a number of hands until it was given to my friend and my former colleague, Robert Parks, who in turn passed it on to me. And this is very typical of this book. In my years at the Morgan working with the manuscript, I have learned that this book is very much a connector. People wish to pass it on, they wish to share it. But of course, we all have our private experiences of books as well, holding those physical volumes in our hand. I first read The Little Prince when I began working at the Morgan 30 years ago, and I learned that Saint-Exupéry's working drafts are held in the Morgan's collection, and we're going to be looking at those together today. So you can see me here in the West Room of J. Pierpont Morgan's library, which is not a place where I generally curl up alone to read a book, but it is a place that reminds me day in and day out of the power of stories and the power of art to really help us understand what makes us human, what connects us, what divides us, and challenges us to make sense of the world and to figure out how best to live in it. That is something that books and art can do. So this is also a story that many of us return to as life goes on. And many people have commented on how the story changes as we return to it. What may have seemed silly and hilarious when we were little and when the book was read to us may become heartbreaking as we grow older. What maybe when we were teenagers seemed absolutely profound may come to seem simplistic or maybe even annoying as we grow older. Or it might be quite the opposite, that what once seemed annoying comes to seem poignant. So I was drawn to return to this book now, as we have all been forced into various degrees of isolation. Staying home a great deal, yes, but also losing much of that social contact that we value so much. We've temporarily lost the ability to gather together in civic spaces like libraries and museums, like the Morgan, of course, where moments like what you see here were once, not so long ago, not uncommon. You can see on the left there, some children gathered around my colleague, Kathleen McLaughlin, who's one of the Morgan's longest serving docents. They're sprawled together on the carpet of the East Room of the library looking at a copy of The Little Prince. And on the right there, you see a group of students from the English Language Immersion Program at CUNY. We had gathered together to look at Saint-Exupéry's drawings, and they suggested new readings to me that I had not considered before. So we can't do this now. And it's really natural to miss that kind of physical communion around books. I know I miss it. I'm sure many of you do. So going back to that image from my title slide, in this COVID era, I remembered that The Little Prince is very much a story about isolation, about physical solitude. And I really wondered what a new reading would reveal to me today, when we really can no longer gather together in the usual way, in the way that you saw on my last slide. So what we're looking at here is one of the watercolors in the Morgan's collection. And it is one that I have come back to again and again because I just find it so heartbreaking. Everything about it, the composition, those muted colors, the vastness of that landscape that's completely devoid of people. Yes, there are some strange things about it. Look at the position of the Little Prince's left arm here. It's a little strange, a little awkward, but that doesn't matter. When we look at this, or at least when I do, we really grasp the important point, his complete solitude. In the book, we see images of the Little Prince, I think about 22 times, and he is never pictured with another human being. Of course, we'll occasionally see him in company with a fox, a flower, a snake, but not with other people. And the story really is about his quest for meaningful connection. That is what he wants. That is what he needs. This drawing, if you haven't seen it before at the Morgan, may be unfamiliar to you because it does not appear in the book. But I believe that it is a preliminary drawing to accompany the episode in which the Little Prince finally reaches Earth. He has left his planet, he's traveled the universe, he's ended up on Earth, but he cannot seem to find any people. I'm going to read to you just a line from the book. From a mountain as high as this one, I shall be able to see the whole planet at one glance and all the people. But of course, he sees no one. The Little Prince just calls out into all that vastness, and all that comes back are his own words. I am all alone. So when Saint-Exupéry revised this illustration for publication, he changed it quite a bit. You see the Little Prince perches much more literally on top of a high mountain. You can see his signature scarf streaming behind him, and his precarious position really exaggerates his solitude. And to me, this whole book really can be read as an acknowledgement of the pain of solitude and an exploration of ways to tolerate it, as we inevitably must, but also ways to mitigate solitude, which we also must do if we're going to survive and if we're going to thrive. So what I'd like to do with you now is go back to the beginning of the story. This page will be very familiar to those of you who know the book well. I want to look at the beginning of the story and go through the book with that theme in mind, and take a look at the manuscript and drawings so we can see how Saint-Exupéry built this work, how he created it, how he used the tools he had, his imagination, of course, his paper, his pencil, his pens, his watercolors, to create this enduring work that is so sometimes inspiring, sometimes frustrating, and often so beautiful. So on the first page, the narrator remembers looking at a book when he was a child. It was a picture book with an image of a boa constrictor eating an animal, which you see here. In other words, the story opens with an act of violence. It's an image of one creature about to crush and consume another. But that's not the immediate point here. The point is that this picture book got a child's imagination revved up. A good book can do that. We all know that. He immediately, after he saw this picture, got out his own crayons and made his own picture. And he would show it to adults. And of course they, in other words, we, would all say, well, that's a hat. Now, take a look closely at the image of that hat, and you'll see what it really is. It's a picture of a boa constrictor who has just eaten an elephant. We just can't see it because we have lost the ability to see what is invisible. So the first page of The Little Prince is really about the power of books, the power of art, the power of the imagination, the power of memory. Saint-Exupéry conveys all of this in just those few opening lines, and he does it with humor. And all of those things, art, books, imagination, memory, are things that can help us feel less alone. Now, when we look at a page like this that has become so familiar, it almost feels like it's almost always been there. It's always been with us. And that, to me, is what is so exciting about looking at literary manuscripts. They remind us of the moment of creation. So as obvious as it sounds, they remind us that someone at some point actually picked up a pen or a pencil and just started writing. And that is what you see here, the birth of the story. On the left is an image of the first page of Saint-Exupéry's draft manuscript. And I want to assure you, this is not just a bad photo. This is how the real thing looks. Very soft, very faint, almost impossible to read. And that's for a number of reasons. You can see that Saint-Exupéry was writing in pencil. And so because this is the first page, it was on top of a stack for many years. And so it has just naturally gotten a little rubbed over the years. So the graphite has softened. You can see that he appears to be writing quite quickly. He's crossed out some words, as we normally do when we're revising. And I'm going to put up a transcription of those first few lines in French, although I've added the diacritical marks, which Saint-Exupéry tends not to use when he's drafting. And here is how those first lines read in English, very straightforward. Now on the right, I'm going to put up the text as published. So you can see it's quite a bit longer. And what you see going on here is very typical of Saint-Exupéry's composition process throughout the manuscript. He seems to have a very clear sense of what he wanted to say, the points that he wanted to make in each chapter, the tone that he wants to establish. Pictures, of course, were very important from the beginning. They are absolutely integral to the story. They're not just tacked on at the end. As he revised, he would, of course, add more detail. Like here he adds the title of the book our narrator was remembering from childhood. Sometimes he would take away details that he deemed superfluous. But from what I can see, all along, he had this very clear narrative vision. So even though you see a lot of change here, the vision was already there in the manuscript. So here's another page after he started writing in pen. This little illustration you see does not appear in the published book, but I believe that this image depicts one of those very serious grown-ups who is standing in judgment of the narrator's drawings, the drawings that he made when he was little. Now look just to the left of the drawing of the man, and you may faintly be able to make out the word skin backwards. I'm going to draw an oval around it. Can some of you see that? Now this slide will make clear what's going on there. This is a beta radiograph image made by my colleague Reba Snyder, paper conservator at the Morgan. And you can see that what you were seeing there is a little bit of the watermark on the paper. Saint-Exupéry used Fidelity onion skin paper. You probably remember that from the era of typing, a very thin paper. And you can also see that this is an American-made paper. I love that this paper actually conveys the fact that The Little Prince was literally made in the USA. Saint-Exupéry wrote the story in New York during the Second World War, a subject that I'll come back to in a little while, and the watermark literally reminds us of that. At the same time that Saint-Exupéry was writing with pencil and pen, he also got himself a set of watercolors. And he must have made quite a number of preliminary drawings. We have some 35 at the Morgan, but he made many more. And almost none of those in our collection correspond directly to the published illustrations, although there are many echoes, as you can see here. In the watercolor at the top, you see a giant hand that does not appear in the published illustration. And that hand belongs to our narrator. That man who was once a little boy, who looked at a book about the primeval forest, picked up his crayons, but stopped drawing after the grown-ups discouraged him. So with that creative spirit just drummed out of him, he went on to become a pilot rather than an artist. So I lived my life alone, he tells us, without anyone that I could really talk to, until I had an accident with my plane in the Sahara Desert 6 years ago. And that's what we see here, the hand of the pilot holding a hammer as he tries to repair that plane. He is alone in the desert when an extraordinarily small person appears before him. And that is how we meet the little prince. But notice how our narrator introduces himself. He absolutely defines himself in terms of his solitude. So I lived my life alone. This book is often described as a story about the importance of retaining the kind of just exciting, vital imagination that children have, the kind of imagination that we sometimes lose as we grow older. And yes, it is very much a story about the importance of being able to see that elephant inside of the boa constrictor. But it's also very much a story about isolation, both physical and emotional. So the first night after his crash, the narrator says, "I went to sleep on the sand 1,000 miles from any human habitation. I was more isolated than a shipwrecked sailor on a raft in the middle of the ocean." And that is how we see him here in this watercolor. He's alone with the wrecked plane. You can just see it visible in the background. But again, Saint-Exupéry chose not to include this illustration in the published book. We do see another illustration in the book that's reminiscent of the one on the left, with the little prince shown with his legs in a similarly awkward position, but we never see the pilot. And in my opinion, there's a reason for that. I think Saint-Exupéry excluded this image because he decided to present the illustrations in the book as the creations of the narrator. They show the narrator's perspective of the little prince's story, not our perspective as readers looking at the narrator. So this one had to go. In fact, one of the first published advertisements for the book, which I'm showing you here, even calls attention to this perspective. I've enlarged the text at the lower left. It notes that Saint-Exupéry had made a series of watercolors to preserve his memories of the little prince. Now, isn't that strange? They're implying that Saint-Exupéry himself had had a real encounter with the little prince. And indeed, Saint-Exupéry understood very well that physical isolation that his narrator that he creates experience, especially during those early years of flight. Saint-Exupéry himself had been an airmail pilot during those early years when pilots flew alone at great risk. They were alone in the cockpit. If they crashed, they were alone and had to find a way out of the situation. And Saint-Exupéry himself did experience that more than once. He crashed in Mauritania in 1927, which was the same year that Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. He crashed again a few years later in the Libyan desert, and he made it out. And his earlier books had all grown out of those experiences as an aviator, alone in the air, alone in the desert. And it was these books, not The Little Prince, that were the ones that made him a best-selling author, not just in France, but in the United States as well. So Saint-Exupéry, when he chose the narrator for The Little Prince, he gave him a profession that he knew well and one that was necessarily isolating. Wind, Sand, and Stars, which you see here, was an illustrated book, but it was illustrated by a different artist, John O'Hara Cosgrave. When Saint-Exupéry came to write The Little Prince, he decided to illustrate it himself. This was the first time he had illustrated one of his own books. And he evoked some similar scenes, like this final image of the desert after the little prince has left it. While the narrator is, of course, dangerously alone after his plane crash, he attributes his emotional isolation to the fact that the adults suppressed his ability to see the unseen, to imagine, to conjure, to use art, in this case drawing, as a way to find meaning and joy. And without that, without art, without those expansive ways of seeing, we do stand alone. And that to me is one of the messages of this book. And so when the Little Prince appears, and what you see here is a variant of the drawing I showed you earlier, he asks the pilot for a drawing. Draw me a sheep, he asks. I'm laughing because that is such a puzzling request. You would think that if a child is lost in the desert and he finds another human being, he would ask for something else first, maybe a drink of water. But no, this mysterious little person, what he wants is a drawing. 1,000 miles from any human habitation, what he wants, what he needs is a work of the imagination. And so he invites the pilot to create. And in that moment of shared imagination, the two form a bond. They are no longer isolated. Now, when I say that the pilot provided the Little Prince with a work of art, well, this is what it looked like in the manuscript on the left and in the first edition. Not really a great masterpiece. And in fact, the Little Prince didn't think much of these drawings either. He thought the first sheep looked too sick. The second one, for heaven's sake, it wasn't even a sheep, it was a ram, it has horns. And the third one there at the bottom was just too old. These were no good, he rejected them. So in exasperation, the pilot gives the Little Prince a picture of a box. You can see him sketching it there on the top. And the Little Prince's imagination is still awake enough that he understands that the sheep that he wants is inside that box. He can see it, even though it's invisible. And as you can see here, the air holes in the box were a later addition. They don't appear in the preliminary drawing. At this point, early in the story, Saint-Exupéry is preparing us for the words of wisdom that come later in the book from the mouth of the fox. And this is the line that most of us remember so well from the book. It's very simple, memorable, but it took Saint-Exupéry some time to get it right when he was composing the story. In fact, in the Morgan manuscript, which comprises about 140 pages of text, I didn't find this famous sentence as we know it a single time. What I did find was this variant. And for those of you who know how to read French, you will see what a challenge it is to decipher Saint-Exupéry's handwriting. I've drawn a blue box around the relevant line here. And I'm going to put up a full transcription of what you see there in French with all the deletions and in English. Again, I don't expect you to read all of this right now. This is just to give you a sense of how Saint-Exupéry worked and how this line that has become so familiar is buried within this paragraph. But this is not the only draft of that famous line that I found. I came across some 14 variants of the fox's secret. You can see them here. But why was there all this focus on invisibility? After we've heard about the pilot's miraculous meeting with the Little Prince, about his tiny planet, we learn that the pilot, as he narrates the story, is looking back. He is remembering the Little Prince, who has gone away and become essentially invisible. 6 years have already passed since my friend went away from me, the pilot tells us. And if I try to describe him here, it is to make sure that I shall not forget him. It is for that purpose, again, that I have bought a box of paints and some pencils. It is hard to take up drawing again at my age when I have never made any picture except those of a boa constrictor from the outside and a boa constrictor from the inside since I was 6. So we don't yet know why the Little Prince has gone. The rest of the book will tell us that. But what we do know is that the pilot is again feeling alone. and that he has had to rely on two things, memory and imagination, to get through that pain, to make that solitude somehow tolerable. So he reaches for his watercolors and he conjures the little prince, both for himself and for us, the people to whom he is telling the story. You see, again, the preliminary watercolor on the left and the published illustration, which has been somewhat revised, on the right. And something the narrator does in that moment also is remind us that he is not much of an artist, after all. So the narrator reminds us in that moment that he really isn't much of an artist, because after all, the grown-ups did not encourage him in that pursuit. And in this way, Saint-Exupéry himself, the author, gives himself an excuse for the awkwardness of some of his own drawings in the book. I mean, he's a pilot, he's not an artist, so of course his renderings of the Little Prince look a little bit weird, as this one does. We learn as the story goes forward that there are some insidious seeds, the seeds of baobab trees on the Little Prince's home planet, and that he had to be absolutely relentless in digging them up so that they did not take root. It looks to me like Saint-Exupéry here was sketching from perhaps a live adult model, and maybe doing some just trials of his watercolors at the bottom. And then on the right, you see the published illustration. The Little Prince describes a situation where there was a planet where there was a lazy man who failed to keep on top of this basic housekeeping. And the Little Prince tells the pilot, "You ought to make a beautiful drawing so that the children where you live can see exactly how all this is." So at the Little Prince's urging, the pilot works especially hard on this drawing of what became a baobab infestation. He describes the labor it cost him to get this drawing just right. And indeed, it does seem that Saint-Exupéry himself labored very much over this particular illustration. There are 3 drawings in the Morgan's collection for this one illustration. You see one on the left, and here are the others. And in the pen sketch on the left, you'll also see some familiar little sketches on the bottom of the page. "Perhaps you will ask me," the pilot says, "why there are no other drawings in this book as magnificent and impressive as this drawing of the baobabs. The reply is simply that I have tried, but with the others, I have not been successful. When I made the drawing of the baobabs, I was carried beyond myself by the inspiring force of urgent necessity." Now, what exactly are Saint-Exupéry and his narrator warning us about? What are these seeds that we must root out before they take over the world? Well, he doesn't say exactly, but whatever it is something that is powerful enough to engulf a planet, as you see here, which brings us to the context in which this story emerged. Here you see this wonderful snapshot of Saint-Exupéry looking very dapper in Midtown Manhattan in the 1940s. He was a reconnaissance pilot in the French Air Force, and he managed to survive his first round of missions, though of course many of his colleagues lost their lives. And after France fell to Germany, he came to New York and settled in the United States. And in New York, he was surrounded by people, but he was also isolated. He was away from home, with his country and indeed the world in great peril. He didn't speak English. He dedicated the Little Prince to a Jewish friend, Léon Vert, who was still back in France. So it's tempting to see the baobabs very literally as a metaphor for German incursions during World War II, that Nazi menace overtaking the planet. But in the book, Saint-Exupéry is not that explicit. He, at this moment and at many points throughout the story, he leaves the space for us, his readers, to define these things for ourselves, to define the evil of the baobabs. It could be hate, it could be racism, it could be intolerance. But whatever it is, that memorable image of the baobabs is a reminder that it is up to us to take action to root out such evils. I want to take you back to this drawing of a single baobab choking the planet with what looks like a multitude of talons. And I want to point out the composition here. We see this again and again, the depiction of a figure on top of a planet alone. There's just no room for anyone else up there. It starts with the dust jacket of the book showing the little prince on his planet or his asteroid, and continues throughout the book. This was something that Saint-Exupéry was doing a great deal around this time, not just when he was depicting the Little Prince. Here, for example, is a sketch that he gave to his friend Elizabeth Raynal, whose husband Eugene was one of the publishers of the Little Prince. That's not the Little Prince, that may be a self-portrait or just a little figure. And here is another beautiful one that he gave to the American artist Joseph Cornell. This is a recent acquisition of the Morgans, showing a very large heavenly figure in that same position. So this is Saint-Exupéry's graphic motif of isolation. For me, the most heartbreaking example of this motif is this one, when we see the Little Prince watching the sunset. He was very fond of watching the sunset, and the Little Prince's planet was so tiny that he could watch the sunset over and over again. All he had to do was watch it once, move his chair a little bit, and watch it again. And on one very, very sad day, he watched that sunset 44 times. Again, you see the beautiful watercolor on the left, and then the way Saint-Exupéry revised it for publication on the right. Apparently, Saint-Exupéry was also thinking about illustrating that phenomenon graphically, with all the lines of longitude, all the meridians marked, and all the time zones labeled. This is a detail of one of the manuscript pages where he made a little sketch to that effect. And I have transcribed for you the text that appears in this block on the side. This illustration, like most of the ones we have seen, did not make it into the book. Now, after that sad day, after the Little Prince decides to leave his planet, after his relationship with his beloved Rose becomes just too problematic and he sets off on his interstellar journey, he visits 6 planets. And each one is inhabited by a single person who is completely isolated. We see that graphically, as I just described, but it's really one particular quality that each of these figures exhibits that simply precludes human intimacy. First of all, we have the king, who is isolated by his position of authority, by his intolerance for dissent. You can see on the left a draft of this illustration of the king, where he's just seated on his throne with his legs strangely splayed out. But Saint-Exupéry has very effectively revised this illustration for publication, showing the king alone on his planet. And the text reads, "The Little Prince looked everywhere to find a place to sit down, but the entire planet was crammed and obstructed by the king's magnificent ermine robe." So in other words, this robe that's just cascading down, this symbol of authority, leaves no space for anyone else. So I'm going to show you just a few other examples of the humans that the Little Prince meets on his journey. The conceited man. This is a person who requires constant praise, who is in fact unable to hear anything except praise. What does it mean to admire? The Little Prince asks him. To admire means that you acknowledge that I am the most attractive, best dressed, wealthiest, and most intelligent man on the planet. So this red-faced egotist is isolated by vanity. And here is the drinker, called the tippler in the 1943 translation, who is isolated not so much by addiction, but by the shame of addiction. Also here alone on top of his planet. Then we have an old gentleman who writes voluminous books. He's a geographer. He's essentially chained to his desk. He's limited by his concept of scholarship, which does not allow him to go out and have experiences in the real world, like an explorer would. So again, isolated. And I'm not sure exactly what's going on with this preliminary drawing, especially with those legs under the desk. Another one with very awkward legs in the preliminary illustration. Then there are a few more stops before the little prince arrives on Earth looking for people. When we get to that moment where the little prince climbs that high mountain and has that conversation with his own echo. I am all alone. Here's another preliminary illustration for that page. It used to puzzle me for a long time because I wasn't sure if that really was the little prince, whether maybe he was wearing a pilot's hat with the flaps down, but it was just as I was preparing this presentation that it became very obvious to me that what he has on is one of those scarves that many people wrap around their heads in the desert. And here is a very powerful image of the little prince's dejection. And again, you see how Saint-Exupéry has altered his draft illustration to emphasize that isolation. He's taken away the tree trunk and inserted instead just those few lines that evoke the empty landscape. But then something wonderful happens. The fox appears, and the little prince's perspective is forever altered. Now, the Morgan doesn't have any preliminary drawings for this particular page, but we do have this. And it looks to me like Saint-Exupéry was sketching a real dog. He did have a boxer named Hannibal, and then maybe starting to adapt the face to look like that of a fox and sort of puffing out the tail. What do you think? Of course, when the little prince meets the fox, he wants to rush in and start playing right away. But the fox says, no, 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 hang on a minute. You have to tame me first. And this word, this concept of taming, it makes sense when you're talking about developing a relationship with an animal, but not so much when you're talking about making a friend. And I know the word has a slightly different meaning in French, but Saint-Exupéry makes clear that he really has a different sense in mind. The fox explains that taming is really not about exerting power. It's more about trust. It's about establishing bonds, establishing ties. And this word was very clearly important to Saint-Exupéry. If I found some 14 variants in the manuscript of what is essential is invisible to the eye, I found some 60 instances of the word for to tame. If you tame me, the fox tells the little prince, we shall need each other. To me, you will be unique in all the world, and I, in turn, shall be unique in all the world to you. And for me, reading this story today, this is the crucial moment. The fox explains that to establish bonds like this, you can't just rush in. You have to sit a little bit away, over there in the grass. And the little prince has to keep coming back day after day, gradually getting a little bit closer, gradually establishing that physical proximity. It takes time. Now, take a look at these two unpublished drawings. Again, I'm not quite sure what is going on here. There are no snails in The Little Prince, and certainly no indication, even in the draft manuscript, that Saint-Exupéry was toying with the idea of having his title character tame an escargot rather than a fox. But these drawings do evoke that slow, patient, socially distant approach that the fox requires. And to achieve that closeness, first, there has to be space. This is, again, one of the most heartbreaking drawings in the Morgan's collection, in part because we can see that echo that had once been crumpled up. Saint-Exupéry must have decided he wanted to discard it. Someone rescued it, whether it was himself or someone else in the room, and unfolded it and preserved it so that we have this record of this vision of the little prince floating. This is a story of a journey with a whole series of encounters. But the two most crucial and the two most rewarding ones are those of the little prince and the pilot, and the little prince and the fox. And in both cases, it takes a great deal of time for them to get close to one another. There is pain involved. There is initial wariness, and ultimately there is trust. There's no denying that this book ends on a note of anguish as our narrator watches the little prince disappear and has to reckon with his absence. And my reading of the story is colored by what I know of the circumstances of its creation and what came after. It was published in New York in 1943, just as Saint-Exupéry received permission to rejoin his reconnaissance squadron to begin flying again. And the following year, after The Little Prince was published in New York, he lost his life on an Allied mission over southern France. The fox tells us, you become responsible for what you have tamed. And it strikes me now that the antidote to isolation is really interdependency of the best sort. Personal interdependency, international interdependency, and that to me is the secret of the fox. Not just that vague advice that what matters most is invisible, but that it is our responsibility to each other that is the most essential truth. So today we wear masks, not to isolate ourselves from each other, but out of mutual care for each other. We keep our distance not because we want to isolate ourselves, but to make it possible for us to come together again safely when we are able.